This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
Today's Best in Climate, the win-wins of climate and biodiversity solutions, was originally published in the Revelator and is part of Covering Climate Now, a global journalism collaboration strengthening coverage of the climate story. Its author, Paul West, is the Director of Special Projects for Project Drawdown and is a researcher at the University of Minnesota. The win-wins of climate and biodiversity solutions. What's better for planets and wildlife is better for the planet. But where do we start to accomplish the best results? The climate is changing, and species are going extinct faster than any time since civilization began. The two crises are not independent. That's good news, and it means that there are solutions that benefit both biodiversity and climate. Nature is already our best defense against runaway increases of greenhouse gas emissions. Earth's lands and waters currently absorb about 40% of the carbon dioxide human activity and natural processes release into the atmosphere. That can't continue, though, without our oceans acidifying and plants reaching the limit of what they can absorb. As an ecologist, I've spent nearly 3 decades working to conserve biodiversity within landscapes largely managed for food and goods production. Now, as Special Projects Director at Project Drawdown, I study how climate solution can benefit the planet's biodiversity. Through all of this work, I've found that many climate-friendly initiatives also help with conservation. Although some solutions can come with costs or trade-offs to plants and animals, what's better for biodiversity is generally better for climate. That means protecting and restoring nature needs to be a critical part of an all-of-the-above set of solutions for reducing the total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Stopping or slowing habitat loss, for example, is good for biodiversity and the climate. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air to grow, and a portion of that carbon is stored in plants and soil. Habitat loss releases the carbon stored in soil and plants, so it's a major source of emissions. Tropical deforestation alone, mostly to clear land for agriculture, accounts for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If deforestation were a country, it would be the third biggest greenhouse gas emitter, trailing only China and the US. Climate solutions can also enhance nature's role as a carbon sink, its ability to store carbon. A complex habitat structure supports more species and stores more carbon at a greater rate. Protecting, restoring, and enhancing biodiversity on managed lands all enhance sinks. In other words, protecting natural habitat both reduces production of greenhouse gases and boosts nature's ability to sock them away. But with so many ecosystems under threat, and the climate crisis getting worse by the day, where do we start? Protect what's left. To achieve the most benefits for both biodiversity and the climate, we must start by protecting the Earth's remaining intact ecosystems. Protecting all remaining habitat is, of course, important, but destroying intact areas disproportionately affects species loss compared to further destroying fragmented areas. And clearing and degrading intact areas is also a double whammy for climate. The existing carbon stock is emitted, and the habitat's ability to act as a sink is lost. It's like the gift that keeps on giving, except it keeps on taking away. And the impact compounds over time. When you include the foregone sequestration, the carbon impact over a decade of clearing tropical forest can be 6 times higher than the immediate emissions alone. Intact areas have more carbon in the vegetation and soils, and a higher species diversity than degraded areas. Intact areas are also better carbon sinks. They store carbon at a faster rate than degraded areas. For example, nearly a fifth of the world's forests are legally protected, yet they store more than a quarter of the carbon accumulated across all forests every year. But protection is not on pace with loss. Forest protected areas almost doubled from 1992 to 2015, from 16.6 to 32.7 thousand square miles. During that same time, nearly 200,000 square miles were deforested. If you had a gap like this between savings and withdrawals in your bank account, you would, and should, be very, very worried. We need to accelerate the rate of designating new protected areas. Protected areas need not be parks. In fact, many of them shouldn't be parks. Indigenous communities play an essential role in protecting biodiversity and reducing the threat of climate change around the world. Areas managed by Indigenous people are commonly more intact than neighboring private and public lands. Securing land and water rights for Indigenous communities is not just good for nature, it helps protect identity and sovereignty. Restore what we can. So, what about habitats that have been altered by human activity? They're still important. Restoring disturbed lands and waters to a natural state boosts their ability to conserve biodiversity and increases their potential to suck carbon from the atmosphere and store it in vegetation and soils. Restorations generally have lower species diversity and a simpler structure than intact ecosystems and are not as effective at storing carbon. However, they're an essential part of recovering ecosystems where only small fragments remain, such as the grasslands of North America, Brazil's Atlantic forest, Mediterranean forests and scrublands in North America, Europe, and Africa, and dry forests of Asia. Unfortunately, the list of endangered ecosystems is much longer than those few examples. Restorations are also less beneficial than protecting intact land from a climate perspective, since carbon accumulates slowly over decades or hundreds of years. And we can't assume that today's acorns will become tomorrow's oak trees, or if they do, that those trees will escape harvest, natural disaster, or pest breakouts long enough to serve as meaningful carbon sinks or legitimate sources of carbon offset credits. Enhance biodiversity on working lands. Of course, not all lands can remain natural. We need space for farms, wood production, roads, homes, and businesses. Croplands and rangelands cover 38% of all land on Earth. Forests cover about another third of the land, of which 60% is managed for timber and other forest products. That means about 58% of all ice-free land is used to produce food and forest products. Several climate solutions can be implemented on agricultural lands, such as agroforestry and managed pastures, also benefiting biodiversity. Several climate solutions that can be implemented on agricultural lands, such as agroforestry and managed pastures, also benefit biodiversity. Although these solutions may provide smaller benefits at the scale of a farm field or forest stand, a little bit of change everywhere can add up to a lot of carbon stored and locally provided species diversity, habit structure, and ecosystem function. Ocean-based solutions exist too, and researchers are learning more about how they benefit both biodiversity and climate. Targeting actions. Each ton of carbon is equally important. The potential avoided emissions and carbon stored for several solutions are summarized in two key publications, the Drawdown Review and Natural Climate Solutions. Rose here, I'll provide links to both of those. For biodiversity, some land, water, and coastlines are more important than others. How much land and water do we need to protect biodiversity? Truth is, we really don't know, but very basic rules are true. More is better, bigger is better, more connected is better, and more geographically and climatologically diverse is better. Initiatives like the Global Safety Net, again, I'll provide a link, lay out a roadmap for conserving biodiversity, maintaining highly productive agricultural lands, and stabilizing climate by protecting or managing 50% of all ice-free land on Earth. Other efforts have identified critical areas or frameworks for protecting marine and freshwater biodiversity. Potentially huge bonus points. Several other climate solutions can indirectly benefit biodiversity. For example, shifting to plant-based diets, reducing food waste, and sustainably intensifying food production on small farms all reduce the need to expand agricultural lands, the biggest cause of habitat loss and degradation. When these solutions are implemented, agriculture's land footprint would not only stop expanding, it could shrink. The land used for grazing or growing animal feed could instead be used to restore ecosystems or to produce fiber and fuel. Big or small, it takes all. We need all efforts, big and small, to solve the biodiversity and climate crises. Yes, we need a concerted effort among governments, companies, and investors for transformational change. But individual efforts, from managing a small fish farm in a mangrove forest to protecting tiny prairie remnants, matter too. Small changes accumulate and help shift the social norm of what we expect from our neighbors, CEOs, and presidents. And an all-in, all-of-the-above approach is essential. All we need are the incentive and the motivation to start. As a side note, the opinions expressed above are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect those of the Revelator, the Center for Biological Diversity, or its employees. So there you have it. Biodiversity loss and climate change, two crises that are very tightly interwoven, which seems like a scary thing, but the way Paul's presented it, it can be a good thing, because as we focus on solutions for one problem, we're actually focusing on solutions for both problems. And I particularly like the fact that Paul calls this an all-in moment. This does feel to me like an all-hands-on-deck moment. And we all can be doing something in our own backyards, composting, not turning soils, planting trees, using native plants. I know in my yard where I do not use pesticides, we attract all kinds of insects, birds, and small animals that do not appear, at least to my eye, in the yards of my pesticide-using neighbors. So all hands on deck, and we set the example and set the expectation of what is normal by doing so. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.